Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Listen In with Nikki and Sara. My name is Sarah Florence Davidson. I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Katzie, the Kwantlen, and the Semiahmoo peoples. My Haida name is Anjak Gusandlance, and I'm going to pass to Nikki.
Hi friends, my name is Nikki Yi, and I am a colonizer of Chinese and Mennonite ancestry, and I am joining today from the traditional and contemporary territory of the Kwe peoples.
And we are going to talk today about evaluating the stories we invite to be teachers. And I don't know if folks remember a couple episodes ago, we chatted about inviting stories into our classrooms, into our teaching to join us as teachers and educators. And we started our conversation today talking about evaluating resources. And then we started thinking, what would be the purpose for these particular resources, and why would we want to be really carefully attending to all these different questions we might have about a resource. And so this is an amalgamation of the work that Nikki and I have done individually in terms of assessing resources and just really thinking deeply about the kinds of resources we might invite to be teachers in our classrooms. And so we're going to go through a series of questions, and I will start with the question of what you might want to think about, and Nikki's going to provide a little bit more information about what that question might mean and what we're intending with that question. So I am going to start off, and our first question is, in terms of thinking about the resources, what underlying social narratives are represented?
Yeah, and so when we are thinking about story is often a reflection of some of those broader social narratives. And so it's really interesting to kind of look at a story and to think about what social narratives are represented here, what is being normalized, what is being discussed. And so when I look at a book like this one, it's called Together a Forest. And I'm just looking at the cover and I'm seeing like a person in a wheelchair who is also Black. I'm noticing different skin tones. And so right away, I'm starting to think, students are in nature. And so there's sort of that interconnectedness. And so I'm starting to think about, okay, well, this author or illustrator has sort of put in that consideration for diversity, for sort of fostering that sense of interconnectedness. And then, so right away, I'm already thinking that, they're maybe pushing back against some of those colonial narratives, which tend to pigeonhole us into one identity or another identity. And so it's just kind of giving that indication of what that broader social narrative might be, that's kind of really guiding the direction of the book.
And I think also you were mentioning, if we look at the language being used in the book as
Yes.
well, like what is, yes, we have the sort of story, but I'm wondering maybe if you can speak to the language choice that you were talking about earlier before we pressed record.
Yeah. So really thinking about how are people described, right? And what kind of language is being used to describe them? Are they being described from a deficit perspective as a problem, or are they being talked about in an appreciative way? So, in this book, the Together a Forest book, this student, it says Alex never wants to stop moving, like they have a motor. They want to visit all of their friends, right? So they're not talking about that movement as being a problem or as being like, Alec needs to fix himself, right? They're saying this is Alec's talent. And so Alec is engaging in this way with the forest, because that's just who they are and how, that engagement occurs. And so really kind of that appreciative focus around diversity as opposed to this lens that says, oh, Alex can't sit still in the classroom, so therefore he has to leave the classroom or, something like that, right? And so having that appreciative lens in this book is really important. But thinking whatever book that we're pulling out, what kind of lens is emerging? What kind of stories being told about diversity and about other people, right? So what are those broader social narratives? Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, especially when we're thinking about diversity, we really want to be sure that we're hearing from folks who belong to those communities. And
Hmm.
so, one of the things that I do immediately when I'm looking at books is I ask, who developed this story? Who wrote this story? Whose voice am I paying attention to? And sort of thinking about the importance of authentic voices. And maybe I can pass over to you again to speak to that.
Yeah, it's lovely when you might know the author who has maybe written the story or written based on their own experiences, as we know from our recent discussion with Sarah. And so, those things are important. I do want to raise sort of a bit of attention because within the area of disabilities, I'm not sure if it's there's a couple of things that are happening. One is that disabilities are often connected to personal medical information. And so to ask someone to reveal a disability can also come along with some very stigmatizing implications, I guess. And so we can't always ask authors to identify as autistic or as having ADHD or other kinds of disabilities, right? That could impact the way that they can interact with the world. So, for example, if you have an autism diagnosis, you might not be able to get a visa to travel to certain countries, right? And so there are very real world implications. So we can't always ask people to disclose that information, and they might not feel comfortable disclosing that information. And then the other piece is that oftentimes people with disabilities, I think what's happening is that the social identity of author and the social identity of disability, for some people, those identities cannot coexist in one person. And so what we often have is like parents of people with, say, Down syndrome or siblings writing about the experience of Down syndrome, and never that person with Down syndrome authoring their own story. And so this is something that we also see within especially the disability literature. But of course, as much as possible, we want to include those voices that come from that place of authenticity. And I think it's, maybe you can speak to the Indigenous community, but in some communities and for some literatures, that's easier to be able to identify than for others. Yeah.
And I think maybe I've seen different recommendations from organizations that maybe represent those communities, which I also look for sometimes. So if I see, so I appreciate you kind of going into the complexities of identity and authorship, but I also I find it really reassuring if I don't belong to a particular community and I'm reviewing a resource I find it a bit reassuring to see that it's been recommended by a particular organization. For Indigenous, in terms of looking at Indigenous authorship, I definitely am looking for information about nations and specific information about relationships to particular communities, and ensuring that we are not seeking outside perspectives to speak to Indigenous lives. And so maybe a little bit different. And I think there is sort of an expectation of a willingness to share that information. But I also would note that it is also very complicated, and for some folks can be very, very painful to speak to their Indigenous identities. And so we do need to be just mindful of that as we're seeking information. But we also want to, I guess, given the opportunity, we definitely, in my case, I want to privilege the voices that are speaking about their own lived experiences, even if it's in a fictional way.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to, how is diversity represented in the story? Because I think we talk about these individual communities, and often we see that representation. We have lots of Indigenous stories where indigeneity is the sort of center of the story, and sometimes this leads us to forget that Indigenous folks, in my case or in my example, belong to lots of different communities as well. And I think you speak a lot to super diversity and thinking about those
Yeah.
multiple identities.
Yeah, and I love this book, Lovely by Jess Hong. And it really, the words are sparse, but a lot can be said through a picture. I know we're going to talk about illustrations coming up, but to see sort of those diverse identities being represented on the page, and having that challenge us and to be willing and open to think about what is challenging us and why. So, for example, like here's a woman scientist who is brown and thinking about like, oh, how often do we see those kinds of things, and or how often do we see Black ballerinas. So kind of just thinking a little bit about how that diversity is represented. So, are we really looking at a story that kind of looks at diversity in sort of a singular way or through just one particular lens? Or are we kind of opening up like how diversity can be understood and appreciated and thought about in kind of this sort of exponentially amplified way, right? So really appreciating all the different ways that we can be diverse and not just thinking about like black and white, as I was showing Sarah earlier. There's one picture in this book where this is the picture for white and this is the picture for black, right? So it's kind of pushing against some of those stereotypical ways of characterizing people, and also just thinking that, what, we are diverse in lots of different ways, and really kind of embracing that super diversity and bringing that forward. I think that resists that kind of stereotype around like, you are Indigenous, therefore your experience is always like this, right? And kind of opening up like we have a multiplicity of identities and experiences, and all of them are so beautiful and interesting. And so those are the kinds of books that I'm looking for. Yeah.
And I'm actually going to segue into our question about what stories do illustrations tell. And since you brought up Indigenous identity, I really, really love this book, Fry Bread,
Mm.
by Kevin Noble Maillard. And I don't know where I had heard the story, but the author was really committed to ensuring that all Indigenous faces were represented, and bodies were represented in this book. And so we do see a lot of different kinds of Indigenous peoples, and I really love that. If we think about the importance of illustrations and how illustrations invite us to relate to the story in particular ways, and I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to that, just sort of the role of illustrations and the importance
Yeah.
of paying attention to those as we're looking at the books.
And this is, I think, a really key point, because when we're talking about picture books, thinking about the affordances of picture books in particular and why they could be important across ages, because picture books give us that opportunity to see diverse identities and to open our minds, to be willing to accept, for example, that Indigenous people can look different ways. So then we're less likely to stereotype. We're less likely to kind of ask questions that make people feel uncomfortable, right? And so we're chatting also in Carolyn Roberts' Tess's Red Dress, how the two sisters are depicted in different, as having different skin tones, right? Because people can be related. I mean, I'm a mixed person, and my skin tone is very different from my brother's, right? And so just getting us open to thinking like, hey, you know what? Sisters don't always look alike. Or there's also this example called A Friend for Henry, where this autistic child is depicted as Asian, and the illustrator is an Asian person. And there are very real implications for this. So oftentimes, and there's a research literature about it, but autistic people are seen as white and they're depicted as white. And because of this, in the classroom, when we see children with potentially autistic, symptoms, I guess is what they would say from a medical perspective, but characteristics that we might think of as consistent with autism. Then for white children, then teachers are more likely to refer them on for diagnoses. But in children of color, they're often more targeted for punitive measures. And so when we start to see children who are Chinese, who are Black, who are, different ethnicities, then we can, in our classrooms, then start to change our thinking because what we understand as normal has changed and evolved. And so I hate the word evolved, but expanded maybe. And so then the way that we act then can change as well. So I think it's important for us to look at these pictures, to engage with stories that challenge us in sort of that visual way, because that helps us to open up.
Yeah, and I appreciate you providing that example of the very kind of important, significant implications of how folks are represented in these stories. And I think um, one of our points was ensuring that the information in the books is accurate. And how do we ensure that the information is accurate? What are the things that we're looking for? I mentioned before, I'm looking for kind of looking at who's sharing the story. There's sort of different communities that they belong to. I'm looking for potentially endorsements from reputable organizations. But what are the other things that we can look for to ensure that the stories are authentic and accurate information?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, all of those pieces that you described are really key. I'm thinking about an assignment that I ask some of my students to do where I ask them to take a story and then compare it to some of the research literature. And I mean, this is something that we can do. I mean, we don't have to do an in-depth dive on every single story that we're reading, but to go to the research and, to learn a little bit about what is autism, what is the prevalence rate in Asian communities, how does it maybe manifest differently across different cultures? And start to ask some of those questions and compare it to the information that's out there, I think is really important, especially within sort of the disability research, so that we're not just perpetuating misinformation about disabilities, but we're actually being thoughtful about, what we're sort of putting forward. There is a lot of misinformation around disabilities, especially ADHD, and there's research around that. But so we need to be thoughtful and mindful about what we're really kind of putting forward in terms of stories. Yeah.
And so the final question we had was just around protocols and potentially confidential information. And I really appreciated what you said earlier about the complexities of authors' identities. And I feel like that kind of connects in with the kind
Mm.
of expectation of some confidentiality and how do we represent that and how are we respectful of that. And I just wanted to add in the context of Indigenous storytelling, and we have talked about this elsewhere, so I won't go into too much detail, but we do want to pay attention when we are working with traditional Indigenous stories and recognizing that even though those stories are often circulated quite widely, when I'm reviewing books that contain those traditional Indigenous stories, I pay a lot of attention to the information that's given. And so in that case, I am looking for an author who belongs to the community where the story is from. So in my case, if it's a Haida story, I'm looking to be sure that that author is either from a Haida community or collaborating with someone from the Haida community. I'm looking for some sort of information or evidence that that story that the people from the community or families have given permission for that story to be shared more broadly. And I'm just looking for some guidance on whether there are some protocols maybe associated. And I've shared the book previously, but there are books that contain the protocols in the book, and that is immensely helpful. And so just being sure that just because something has been published doesn't mean that we can use it in all the ways that we might use it or bring it into our classroom. And so just attending to that, and especially when we have those traditional Indigenous stories, that we're just thinking a little bit more about how we bring them into our classroom in respectful and responsible ways.
Yeah, I do want to mention your book, Sarah, because Dancing with Our Ancestors, I know I mentioned it earlier, but to me, this book, like it's about a potlatch, but you're not going into sort of that ceremonial information around the potlatch. Like you're talking more about like the community getting together and all of those pieces. But to me, this is a really good example of how I can learn more about, the potlatch without kind of crossing that line into information that is maybe not appropriate to share. Maybe do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I appreciate that reminder because I think when we talk about ceremonial information specifically, and that's a great example, which I never thought to use somehow. But I do appreciate when information is shared, and kind of the little rule of thumb that I use sometimes is the information in a particular book enough that I feel like I could replicate it? And if it is, that to me feels like maybe they've shared a little bit too much information if it's something that cannot be done by a wide group of people, whoever picks up the book. So I am looking for that inclusion because that is a part. I mean, in my case, I've grown up attending potlatches. It would be odd to not share that part of my life, but ensuring that I'm sharing it in a way that is respectful. It was reviewed carefully by my father and other folks before it was shared. And it does have general information and not really specific information because it wouldn't be appropriate for folks to engage in a potlatch unless they have those connections back to the community.
And there's so much that we can discuss around like being grateful, being in community, serving each other. Like, there's all of these really great ideas that I think are very transferable, and people of different cultures can talk about how we all manifest these kinds of fundamental values without having to go into the specifics of like, more sort of sacred knowledge as they talk about in the First Peoples Principles, or like other things that are really kind of intended for a more localized sort of community understanding and practice. So yeah, I think there are lots of things that we can discuss as educators within our classrooms using these kinds of books without kind of crossing that line. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So thank you for joining us today. And as usual, the resources are listed in the comments, and we'll see you next time.